This lecture turns to what happened to the Roman Empire following the collapse of the western part in 410, with Byzantine art in Constantinople and before Iconoclasm. Now, the periods of Byzantine art are known as the Golden Ages. Thus, the periods in which they're creating art are dominated by an emphasis on mosaics and the holy qualities associated with them in churches, as well as large structures from the Hagia Sophia onward. The early Byzantine period begins with Justinian and ends with Iconoclasm. It picks back up in the Middle Byzantine period when iconoclasm is removed and imagery is reinstated in churches. And the Middle period lasts until the Fourth Crusade, whereby Western Crusaders are going to occupy the city of Constantinople. Once they regain control in 1261, Byzantium will still exist until 1453, when they're finally conquered by the Ottoman Turks. Now, whereas the Western Empire will be sacked in 410 Common Era, the Eastern Empire, if you remember, Constantine moves his capital to Constantinople, which is going to be on the edge of the western section of the world and the eastern, or Europe and Asia, straddling two continents, the only city to do so. Here, the Eastern Empire would last for another 1,000 years and would not be conquered until 1453, well into the Renaissance. The eastern section of the empire was beneficial in that it's going to be the center for trade and the gateway to the east. Therefore, it propped itself up on the monies made from trade. In the west, when you have the division of the Roman Empire into east and western sections with Diocletian, we find the west is going to survive primarily on agricultural aspects of the economy. Therefore, it cannot prop itself up. So the Golden Ages, with the early Byzantine period of 527 to 726, is going to last from the Emperor Justinian all the way to Iconoclasm. Justinian is the first great Byzantine emperor after Constantine himself, ruling from 527 to 565. He would establish one true Christianity, that being Orthodox Christianity as the only legal religion. This is very different than Roman Catholicism and lasts until today in the Orthodox communities. He did so by stamping out all other types of religions, including Arian Christianity and others. He also rewrote the Roman law code, otherwise known as the Justinianic Code, or the Corpus Juris Civilis. We find here he resurrected the Roman imperial combination of secular and religious power known as Caesaropapism, whereby the Pope and the Emperor are one and the same, ruling over the secular part of the country, controlling the military, and also controlling its religion. This idea of Caesaropapism is going to come from the Roman emperors themselves. Augustus was the first to combine temporal power with religious power, as in 27 BCE the Senate will bestow upon him the title of princeps, or first citizen, that being chief among all in the empire. In 12 BCE, he's then given the title Pontifex Maximus, or the chief priest of the state religion, the title still held by the Pope today in the Vatican. Now, in the Nika riots of 532, the political factions of the Greens and Blues massacred each other. This also destroyed half of Constantinople and began and ended in the Great Hippodrome, or the chariot racing arena that we have in the center of Constantinople. It was only put down finally by Belisarius, the great general of Justinian, whereby tens of thousands would be slaughtered, being lured back to the Hippodrome in order to quell these riots. Now, the riots unfortunately destroyed much of imperial Constantinople, including the Constantinian Imperial Palace, the original Hagia Sophia, and Apostolion. Justinian had to rebuild them in order to revive the glories of old Rome in New Rome, as he called it. So therefore we have a number of building projects that are underway by Justinian that will secure his legacy. We see here in Justinian as World Conqueror a small Barberini ivory from the mid-6th century. He shows himself as a defender of faith in the circular portrait above, the Imago Clepeta, whereby it's supported by angels with Christ's blessing in the center. Here we have many sources taken from the Roman Empire, including the dynamic postures, the personifications of the bountiful earth below Justinian's horse, and the palm-bearing victory that we see is going to be crowning him, much like Nike, the goddess of victory from antiquity. Barbarians are also seeking clemency below. So the barbarians in the lower section with these exotic animals show that Justinian's empire extends to Africa and Asia, obviously shown through the lion and the tiger, these animals indigenous, not to Europe, but instead to another continent. Even Justinian himself is shown in an equestrian portrait, straddling a horse, that would make everyone think of the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius, thought to be the equestrian statue of Constantine at the time. Here he is tying himself back to the original Roman emperors and reviving the greatness of ancient Rome. This new Rome is going to use the iconography of earlier emperors to communicate the power, the prosperity, and of course the justification that these emperors had for conquest. He also is going to attempt to reconstitute the Roman Empire as a whole, sending his generals Belisarius and Narses to expel the Ostrogoths, Vandals, Bulgars, Sasanians, and to revive the glory of old Rome in new Rome. And what is amazing, of course, is that they have a measure of success in actually doing so. Now, once again, we find that the Mediterranean Sea was a Roman lake. In order to cement his name in the records, we know that Justinian wants the largest, most grand cathedral ever built, and he's going to hire Anthemius of Tralles and Isidorus of Miletus to do so, and that becomes the Hagia Sophia, one of the most famous structures in the East. Here, we must note that these elements are not part of the original plan, which include minarets and buttressing. We know there was an earthquake, and so we had to reinforce part of the structure. When the Turks take over Constantinople in 1453, renaming it Istanbul, they convert this massive Christian Orthodox cathedral to a mosque, whitewashing the interior and introducing new Arabic elements. The design, however, is for a Christian Orthodox church and is like nothing that came before it. We know, of course, that Justinian hires these two architects, one being a theoretical professor of mathematics at the local university. And it is meant to rival all churches that were ever made before, as is recorded by his historian. It surpasses in scale and magnificence, according to Justinian, the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, which is the touchstone for all great architectural structures, because of how impressive the description is of the Temple of Solomon in the Old Testament. In order to create this new grand structure, Justinian did not rely upon traditional architects or masons, but instead theoretical scientists who taught at the local university. Anthemius of Tralles, for instance, specialized in geometry and theories of statics and kinetics, whereas Isidorus of Miletus is a physics professor at the universities of Alexandria and Constantinople, and was an author on vaulting techniques. In order to see what the Hagia Sophia would look like, here we have the Apostolion being rebuilt in 536 with a Greek cross plan with domes over the four arms of the cross, much like San Marco in Venice. Here we have an experiment for what Hagia Sophia would look like in miniature with Saints Sergios and Bacchus. On the inside, we can see this unified interior space and these windows that let in light throughout. Now it is converted to a mosque, but was originally built as an Orthodox church. The double-shelled plan with the dome, the octagonal core, ambulatories, and galleries, all are going to be predecessors to the great Hagia Sophia, letting this unified plan serve this new religious and liturgical function. with the lessons learned from St. Sergius and Bacchus. Using very thin bricks embedded in the mortar and a vaulted dome, they then turn their attention to the larger project of Hagia Sophia, seen here in the lower right. And one can see the similarities between the two structures, that is centrally planned with side aisles, and then you would enter through a narthex in the front.
Turning to a plan of the Hagia Sophia, or the Church of Holy Wisdom, we can see that it is 270 feet long and almost as wide. It does have a longitudinal pull along the nave and the central axis, but is not as long as Old St. Peter's in Rome. Instead, it is going to be vertically oriented and more centrally planned. Its dome is 108 feet wide and then 180 feet from the pavement below. A massive interior space that lets in and bathes the interior space with light. The effect, even after it was whitewashed and the golden glimmering mosaics removed from the interior space, is still bright and airy. With 40 windows below the dome, we let in this ring of light, as well as from the walls below with light ashlar masonry. Procopius, the Greek historian of Justinian, tells us that it appeared as though it was a golden chain that was lowered from heaven. And of course, the light is very important for Orthodox Christianity, for it is the presence of God inside the structure. Pseudo-Dionysius tells us as such in his The Divine Names, when he states that light comes from the good, and light is the visual image of God. So we know that light here on earth is going to reflect and radiate from the effigy, the face of God, reflecting through the mirrors of the angels until we see earthly light here, that faint glow that's going to come from God himself. Now, the way in which we are able to get so much light in the interior space here at the Hagia Sophia is going to be a new technology of engineering by the Byzantines. Now, throughout Byzantine history, they will use either pendentives or squinches to build their massive structures. In this early phase of Byzantine architecture, we are using pendentives, from Latin pendere, to hang, in which, of course, you find the dome and these great piers are going to hang from the structure, which transfers the weight from this massive dome to the piers beneath instead of to the walls. What this allows then is for the walls to be opened up if necessary for windows, letting in even more light to the interior space.
As with this dome, we have a central core like a giant freestanding baldacchino, like one would have seen at Old St. Peter's, or how we see it now with the baldacchino by Bernini in New St. Peter's. Here we can see that the four pillars hold up this massive dome. Therefore, this is possible thanks to the design of the pendentives and the engineering that was behind it.
Here, if we compare the Hagia Sophia to the Pantheon, we should note that the Pantheon is a hemispherical dome on a drum made of solid concrete. Therefore, it can be wider because it is transferring the weight of this dome equally to the drum on all sides. On the other hand, Hagia Sophia's dome is hemispherical and it sets on pendentives. Hence, it is going to distribute the weight to 4 specific points at the edges of the dome, not equally across a drum. Therefore, it cannot be as large. Also, the Hagia Sophia's dome is going to be penetrated by windows at the base, further weakening it so it cannot be larger. The interior effect, then, is going to have the Pantheon letting in one oculus, or one circular area of light that shifts throughout the day, and it is the only light source unless the door is open as well. At the Hagia Sophia, we note that light comes in radiating from all angles, from the base of the dome, to the walls, to the apses. The interior space before the advent of electricity is bathed in light here. The plan, importantly, of the Hagia Sophia takes important precedence from the Pantheon and Old St. Peter's, or a vertically oriented central plan, such as that in the Pantheon with a massive open interior space, and combines that with a longitudinal pull and orientation of a Roman basilica that was transferred and converted for Christian use. Now, the reason why the Hagia Sophia looks so different from those Roman Catholic churches in the West is the nature of the Orthodox liturgy. In fact, the laity in Orthodox Christianity does not worship in the center of the structure. Instead, that is set aside for the clergy and the imperial family. And remember, in the East, as with Rome itself, back thinking of Octavian and Augustus, the first Roman emperor who was named Pontifex Maximus, the emperor in the Byzantine East is the head of the church. So we find that there is a procession that begins in the narthex, where the imperial family will meet the clergy and walk around the center of the structure, while we, the laity, are off to the side. This can be seen in modern-day Orthodox Mass ceremonies and other liturgical processions, in which the clergy are going to walk around in the center of the structure, burning candles, swinging incense burners, and chanting in Greek. We know that in the Hagia Sophia, the emperor would join the clergy, process together down the nave, showing that he is God's select person here on earth to oversee this liturgy, and that he would present gifts of gold to the clergy. Deacons would then bring the Eucharist blessed by the bishop. Therefore, seeing this procession, hearing once again the chanting, seeing light pouring in through the windows, smelling the sweet smell of incense, looking at candles burning, we are catching glimpses of heaven on earth with this royal retinue and the clergy. However, the original mosaics do not survive intact at Hagia Sophia, being whitewashed by Muslims who took it over in 1453. To understand what it originally would have looked like, we must look elsewhere.
With this great accomplishment, there is a dedication inscribed on the interior of December 27th, 537, that actually states, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," thus tying the original intent of the Hagia Sophia to the success of Justinian. He has surpassed the Temple of Solomon. Now, the mosaics that once existed were whitewashed or destroyed by the Turks, but it was fully decorated under Justinian in this early Byzantine period.
We have an example of that in Hagia Sophia, where the Virgin Theotokos in Christ will be enthroned in an apse mosaic. Apses, of course, representing heaven. The gold surrounding the Mother of God on this throne and her Son, representing the heavenly aura that would reflect the light coming in from the various windows. She wears red shoes, again reserved for Roman emperors in the East. The inscription below this reads, "The pious emperors," that is Basil I, "replaced ones that the impostors or the iconoclasts had destroyed." Hence, defacing the image and the visage of Christ was seen as an attack on Christianity itself. Here we have a new eclecticism from the Greco-Roman naturalism that will be combined with that Byzantine penchant for flatness and stylization. Compared to the earlier Theotokos, we can see that the throne is at an angle to the so-called picture plane, and can be read as hovering in space. While at the same time, the drapery is even more schematic, not showing tonal variations from the highlights to the shadows as had earlier been blended haptically. Now we find there is an optic approach to the drapery.
Though Justinian's mosaics have been destroyed, they could have continued the evolution of the Theotokos, as seen in this later 9th century version, and had her enthroned in these domed apse structures. Now, art in Constantinople under Justinian is often going to be seen as sumptuary arts, whereby we have secular or religious works of art that are quite small in scale, whether they be sculpture, metalwork, manuscripts, or textiles, such as the portrait of Ariadne here from the early 6th century. Here we have an empress who died in 515 before Justinian and was married to Anastasis I. Here we have an advanced type of abstraction which already shows the evolution of cult images for representations in Byzantine art. The scepter and the orb surmounted by a cross is common in Eastern imperial regalia that is also going to be worn by Ariadne here, this empress. If we compare it to other iconic types, she is forward-facing. Very large eyes are going to be seen in this very symmetrical composition, staring directly out at you in a fully frontal way. Thus, we find this notion of not tying it to a narrative, but instead to an iconic understanding, much like a saint. And we find that emperors and empresses in Constantinople under Justinian were shown as saints in the same way. The equation of rulers with religious figures was seen with Justinian himself and aligning himself with Christ above, but now taking that a step further, actually showing the ruling class as representing God on earth. Here we have the largest surviving example of this, which is half of a diptych with Archangel Michael from the early 6th century under Justinian as well. In it, we have a staff with a large orb surmounted by a jeweled cross, this imperial symbol that would have been held by angelic and religious figures as well as imperial figures, thus showing how similar they are. Each of these figures, one divine and one mortal, still holds a staff with their left hand, showing their secular rule and power and dominion over the earth, and with their right, a globe representing the earth surmounted by a cross, showing that Christianity rules the world. Thus, the emperor and the empress are the representatives of God on earth. The court artist here had a very delicate way of engraving lines. See this in the hair and the wings, for instance, with the feathers of Archangel Michael, as well as the falling folds of the tunic and the pallium that we have here, both with the pallidamentum of Justinian, this cape that he wears over his cuirass, or that being draped across Archangel Michael's shoulders. The inscription on this carving reads, "Receive the suppliant before you, despite his sinfulness." Thus, the diptych would have probably had an imperial portrait, much like that of Ariadne, on the other side. Thus, we find Archangel Michael, the very angel who cast Lucifer out of heaven after his revolt, is going to be presenting this imperial person to God for reception into heaven. Now, in the 5th century, Christianity is going to be restored as the state religion, and Thessaloniki as a provincial capital. As we discussed when the empire was divided, it was a very important city. So that is not going to be subject to Rome any longer, but instead to Constantinople until 732. Here we find a plague devastates the city in 586, and tribes of Slavs and Avars are going to endanger the city. Here we find the rise of the cult of saints that were called upon to protect the city, in this case Saint Demetrius being very popular in Thessaloniki. Here in the Maestas Domini, we have an apse mosaic with Christ enthroned once again in paradise, holding the word of God with his left hand unfurled, raising his right, with the images and symbols of the 4 gospel writers on all 4 sides of him. Here we find there is a scroll which actually states, "I am the spring of living water." Down below, appropriately, we have the 4 rivers of paradise spilling before his throne, the promise of salvation if one follows the gospel. The Maestas Domini, or youthful savior, is in a rainbow aureola with 4 evangelist symbols surrounding it. Prophets also flank either side from the Old Testament, specifically John and Ezekiel, both showing the same vision, but Ezekiel looks away. Here we have the 5th century experimentation becoming a bit more consistent under Justinian and this Orthodox tradition, whereby heaven was shown in many different ways, with Christ in the clouds with different gospel writers or with different saints. Now we see him more consistently in an oval mandorla. Now, turning to Hagios Demetrios in Thessaloniki, this patron saint they called upon for protection, we're going to see here an ex voto on the interior. or a type of image which is made from the vow, made literally, which is a votive offering given to a deity or divinity. In this case, representing Saints Demetrios with Bishop Johannes and Prefect Leonidas. In this mosaic, we have an ex voto with a portrait, in this instance with a saint. The saint was a member of the senatorial family and an army officer, and interceded on the behalf of the city. Hence, he is the patron saint of the city. Would come down and protect the city, for instance. The inscription below in Greek actually reads, "You see the donors of the glorious house on either side of the martyr Demetrios, who turned aside the barbarous wave of barbarian fleets and was the city's salvation," thus speaking to how he protected the city, appropriate for an ex voto, that being, we create this to give thanks to the saint for protecting us. Again, we have this notion of protecting and sanctioning, whereby the saint is going to be sanctioning these other rulers and or bishop or religious leaders of the city, putting his hands on them, thus, of course, showing that they have the righteousness and or the protection of the saint, much like Christ and Saint Menace here that we discussed. Here we can see this type of ex voto and a saint protecting people in many different examples. This one, of course, is showing the saint picked out, remember, by the golden orb and halo around their head, protecting mortals and or showing that they are under their protection. So this is a new type of personalized devotion that we see in the Byzantine world, where pictures are not meant to educate in a didactic fashion as seen here at the right, such as telling you the story of Christ, but instead offer you a direct confrontation with divinity. Now, turning to St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, Egypt, we have an example first that we'll discuss in this class of a monastery, which is an enclosed compound for monks, often with a garrison of soldiers to protect them as they are in hostile territory. Now, here in Mount Sinai, we have a very important location for Christians, Jews, and later Muslims, in which we find Moses receiving the commandments here and marking the spot of the burning bush. And that is how they decided to build this monastery, where God is going to speak to Moses through the burning bush. Justinian would rebuild this monastery from 548 to 565 as a pilgrimage destination for those Christians traveling down to Egypt in the Middle East. He sent artists from Constantinople to decorate the church in lavish mosaics, such as those we saw at Hagia Sophia, and dedicated it to the Virgin Mary, who, remember, was officially recognized as the Mother of God, or Theotokos. Here we have an example of said mosaics with Christ in an oval mandorla surrounded by different Old Testament figures and or the New Testament ones, as he's going to be in a transfiguration state. Here, the transfiguration of Christ is going to be seen as an apse mosaic in this monastery, and has as expected Elijah and Moses, the two Old Testament figures that appear as Christ is going to transfigure or transform into white garments and hover in the air, whereby the three members in the New Testament that are with him, John, Peter, and James, are going to be cast to the ground, blinded by this white light and vision that they see. Behind them, the gold of the mosaic would shimmer in the light, thus, of course, reflecting the holy nature of this event. So the mandorla, or almond-shaped areola of light surrounding Christ, becomes common in these different rainbow-type striations. The similar design can be seen here from the early mosaics in Rome we looked at, but they retreat from naturalism. They are not attempting to recreate the physical world. Instead, we see flat forms with linear details that avoid overlapping of the figures, so we cannot place them in space. In fact, we omit three-dimensional space altogether. We cannot see where they are. That's not the point, because we're not seeing with physical eyes. We're instead seeing with spiritual eyes. So Plotinus in his Aeneids, importantly a late antique Neoplatonic philosopher, would state that artists are not attempting to copy natural objects to show the truth of things, but instead portray higher images. In rejecting spatial illusionism, they depict objects close at hand in their fullest dimensions, but forms should not overlap or conceal other forms, and colors must be pure and bright to capture the pure forms as discussed by Plato, that being things that are in the spiritual realm, not in the physical realm. So the stability and permanence that is fashioned by these Byzantine artists would require a frontal position such as the ones of saints we saw and the one held by Christ here, and would regard the viewer directly in order to participate in this spiritual event, thus looking directly out at the viewer face to face with them. Another example of that can be seen in one of the most popular and famous icons in all of Christian history, the Christ from 700 from this monastery. Now, there are hundreds of icons found at the monastery, and we find that icons are one of the most common types of works that we see in Byzantine art. They are painted wooden panels with a thin layer of plaster, generally of tempera or encaustic on here. They are for private veneration and devotion because of their size. They're a small panel that you pray to directly, facing divinity. In this case, we have the classical Christ with a beard facing outward, holding a book and giving us the blessing of benediction. But he is also combined with Christ Pantocrator, or Christ as judge. The asymmetrical eyes are going to be staring outward, much like we saw earlier with Christ and St. Menace here, this Coptic example of Christianity in ancient Egypt. For comparison, here is St. Peter, the first pope, who is going to be shown much like Christ facing forward, but in this case, instead of the blessing of benediction, in his right hand he holds the keys to the kingdom of heaven and earth. Here we find there are small panels. Both of them are half-length figures, posed frontally and directly engaging the viewer. In the St. Peter example, we have a formalized deisis group, or Christ flanked by St. John and the Virgin Mary. That's what we see at the Last Judgment as we move forward into the Middle Ages. Now, the crosier is going to be the cross held by bishops in processions. So here, St. Peter is shown as the first bishop, holding the keys to the kingdom of heaven, showing in Caesaropapism that the emperor is going to now be the new pope and also head of the state as emperor. Here in another example of a very popular type of icon, we have the Virgin Theotokos, or the Madonna and Child enthroned as we are in heaven, that being the Madonna is the queen of heaven. Here we find they are between Saints Theodore and George. Above them, you'll notice we have angels in the hand of God. Therefore, the importance of the Virgin would expand in art, seen in hundreds and hundreds of these icon paintings, whereby she is shown as an intercessor on our behalf. We can pray to her because she gave birth to Christ, thus can intercede for us as a mother. Being maternal, she would understand the foibles and the failings that we face. Here, as with the other icon portraits, we have frontally facing figures. In this instance, though, full length, but they stare outward. Technically, the access to the scene or the focalizer in the Virgin Mary example, the Theotokos, would be the saints beside her. So you'll notice that the truly divine figures often look off to the side like the Virgin Mary or Christ in the last example. People who were human like us, the saints, are going to look out at us. They are our engagement and our entree into the scene. So the angels, you'll notice, look heavenward, reminding us of the rewards of the Christian life up towards the hand of God. The Virgin and Christ child look beyond the viewer, off to the sides. The Virgin looks sorrowful, for she understands the future events, that of course her child will be sacrificed, and so she often looks melancholic. The saints on either side are going to look directly at us, therefore they are the conduits to approach the divine and attain heaven. If we look at their position, you notice that we stare at the saints. They then are going to draw our attention to the Virgin Mary and Christ child, who bring us up to the angels and finally upwards to heaven with God himself. So here we have this small painting that we directly engage with, one-on-one, praying and receiving this miraculous vision. It is not narrative, it is not didactic, it does not teach us a moral lesson. Instead, we are face to face with divinity, and that is the primary difference between Byzantine art and that in the West, the more naturalistic approaches we've seen in the 5th and 6th centuries. Turning now to Byzantine art in Ravenna, we have the best surviving city that is going to be decorated at this time in a province controlled by Byzantium. Now, in the early period, we find that Justinian is going to reclaim much of the territory that was lost in the Western Empire and begin decorating and building on this area. So the influences of the native Ravenite style on Byzantine art can be seen in the 5th and the early 6th centuries, leading to its conquest with Justinian. Now, what we know of Justinian is that he is going to want to reclaim the area to the west. And when he does, this sacred fortress of Byzantium, of Ravenna, this small town on the Adriatic coast, will be retained and still controlled by the Byzantines for another 2 centuries. It is below the Adriatic coast, below Venice, and is going to be one of the best surviving examples of early Byzantine art and churches. Here in 402, Emperor Honorius is going to move the western capital from Milan to Ravenna, which of course means that it was more easily defensible, and the barbarian hordes, as they understood it, would have a harder time attacking them. So now it is an imperial residence by the time we get to the 5th century. Now here, the mausoleum of Galla Placidia, or the sister of Galla Placidia of the emperor, we find a building program around the mausoleum after the emperor's death. In this particular example, we have a mausoleum for Galla Placidia, the sister of the emperor, dedicated to St. Lawrence, in a Greek cross plan with barrel vaults over a central dome on pendentives, the same engineering technology used on a much smaller scale, granted, but the same engineering technology used from Hagia Sophia. Here we have blue-gold mosaics inside that are going to be preserved in a vault and 2 lunettes over the doors and the transept. Here we have a great example of mosaics of the early Christian era in the Italian peninsula. So here's the interior view showing multiple scenes that do have much more naturalistic approaches compared to their Byzantine counterparts. If we look up at the vault, you'll notice there is a cross with these golden stars. In the lunettes, these sections, the triangular sections below where the pendentives are, we have the 4 symbols of the gospel writers again. The angel for St. Matthew, the bull for St. Luke, the winged lion for St. Mark, and the eagle for St. John. The pendentives here are going to support the structure and foretell, nearly 100 years earlier, what will happen in Byzantine architecture with Hagia Sophia. Here in the lunette mosaic in the north arm of the mausoleum, we have the Good Shepherd, the image of Christ shown in paradise with his flock surrounding him, dressed in this instance as a priest and holding the crosier with his halo behind him. So here we no longer see the bucolic figure of Christ dressed down as a shepherd in rustic clothing, but we still have the same type of motifs with paradise and the sheep surrounding this shepherd. The gold and purple robes and the golden scepter show that he is now a prince of the imperial family, much like the Pope will carry the golden crosier today and wear the same type of golden robes. Turning to St. Lawrence in the other lunette mosaic in the south arm of the mausoleum, we have much more naturalism that's going to be shown and retained from the classical era in the 5th century from mosaics. In it, we see the instrument of St. Lawrence's martyrdom in the center. He's grilled alive, along with a bookcase to the left with the Gospels displayed in Latin for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Here we have an early martyrdom scene, which is quite unusual in Christian art. Now, this shows us that we have the rise of the cult of the saints, whereby more and more importance is given to those who gave their lives for Christ and thus became early Christian saints. Here we find that St. Lawrence is going to carry the scripture and the scepter like Christ in the opposite lunette. Notice, of course, you can see the mosaics here in the tesserae, the individual colored tiles that make up this image, thousands and thousands of them, from blues to whites to oranges. Here we find the same type of image that would be replicated from Christ carrying the cross to his martyrdom. Thus St. Lawrence is an imitatio Christi, or an imitation of Christ, who is going willingly to his death as Christ did to his crucifixion. Here we can see again how the images relate to one another. They face one another across, once again, the transept. One, of course, holding the cross as he walks to his martyrdom, the other, Christ in paradise, awaiting the sacrifice of St. Lawrence and his promise of salvation. So saints' days are going to be celebrated on the day of their death, not their birth. Thus, this is related to the sacrament of baptism. So we find here a saint's day is when they are martyred. And so this St. Lawrence's day, you'd have a feast celebrating this, associated with the mausoleum and the death of the emperor's sister. Speaking of the sacrament of baptism, we should now turn to the baptistries that were built during this era, all octagonal in shape. Now, they are octagonal because the number 8 was a symbol of regeneration. Thus, it relates to the book of Genesis and the 6 days of creation, followed by a day of rest, and finally a day of recreation through baptism. So 8 equals resurrection. We die in baptism and are reborn into the church. Additionally, an octagonal structure combines a circle, the dome, representing heaven, and a square base representing earth. Thus, the octagonal structure is the transition from earth to heaven, thus forming the shape of an octagon. So once again, we move from the earth where there is death and there is a temporal understanding to the eternal understanding of a dome with a circle, because there's no beginning or end in a circle. Here, the shape is actually derived from ancient Roman pagan mausolea, like that of Diocletian, that also transitions from a square to a dome above with an octagon. Now, this Orthodox baptistry in Ravenna was remodeled once Ravenna became the capital city, under Bishop Neon, who also is going to have it lavished with mosaics and stuccoed niches. Above, we find that the saints will be below in the terrestrial landscape, and then partitioned into 8 divisions, alternating with the altar table and thrones, thus, of course, preparing for the second coming of Christ. We can see this down below with the this book on this table, thus, of course, the word telling you he will return. Above, we find these saints are not separate from the celestial realm in the vault, but are instead located in a shallow landscape surrounding him. But the spatial unity in the example is disrupted by these candelabra, so they cannot move in the space between one saint to the next. In the center, we have everything around the baptism of Christ, rather appropriate for a baptistry. This example coming from Matthew 3:17, whereby we hear a voice after Christ is baptized by John the Baptist, and God will say, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased." What is interesting about the representation is, even though we're in the 5th century, we retain many late antique and pagan motifs and symbols, such as the river god, the god of Jordan here, much like the spring we saw earlier in the Vienna Genesis, thus locating us in a particular place. Additionally, we find that the representations of paradise are also going to be quite common surrounding this bucolic scene. In the close-up of the mosaic, we can see the tesserae and the hard bounded outlines that are very common for mosaics at this time, making them visible at a distance and the gestures more apparent. Turning now to Theodoric, we have the king of the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths, who was then in Italy. He was taken hostage in his youth to Constantinople, where he was educated under the Byzantine Emperor Zeno, who then sent him to control the barbarians on the frontiers. So leading the Ostrogoths to North Italy, he ruled Ravenna as a vice-regent for Byzantium. He wanted to establish autonomous rule and an empire in Italy, but Roman and Byzantine churches would not allow that because of his Arian faith. So now we need to look at what Arian decorations in Christianity look like. Arian Christianity, very importantly, disavows the Holy Trinity and believes that Christ and God are separate entities and not part of the same being. Here in an Arian baptistry in Ravenna, around the same time as the last one, we can see the differences in decoration. On the interior, we notice that we have the same type of representation with saints surrounding a baptism scene. The flattened and frozen example here is mechanically aligned to reinforce this pattern that alternates throughout. The repetition of white silhouettes separated by palm trees is going to echo that of the candelabras in the Orthodox baptistry, also in Ravenna. The lower register with altars and thrones in this example, however, is eliminated. Comparing the two baptism scenes, we still have the river god present showing us we're at the River Jordan. We still have Christ in the center with the dove of the Holy Spirit above, and St. John the Baptist who's going to be pouring water on his head. The illusionistic Byzantine style is going to be absorbing the abstraction of the Arian, so we see the two coming together in Ravenna. Now, the mixture of Ostrogothic and Byzantine elements can also be seen in the mausoleum of Theodoric himself, which is a centrally planned structure. Here we can see this, it's much like the ancient Roman imperial mausolea in that we have the octagonal space that is surmounted by this dome. So the shape is derived, like the baptistries, from those mausolea, like the palace of Diocletian, where we have his mausoleum, with a lower section of archways and an octagonal shape surmounted again by a dome, with this mausolea rotunda, as it is known. Here we find the dome is actually a 300-ton stone slab, not one supported individually by masonry, a very impressive feat. The abstract, stylized, rounded head pincers that we have here are very common and seen in Ostrogothic design for jewelry, now in a monumental fashion on a piece of stone carved that is 300 tons. So these pincers, if you can see here, are going to come over into early medieval work, as with northern traditions, such as the Goths and Ostrogoths and others, whereby you'll have a beak that's pecking out an eye. The 12 rectangular loops are going to be inscribed with the names of the apostles. So these possibly could have been used to lift it into place as you're going to cap the top of the mausoleum after the emperor would have been laid to rest. The traditional imperial material for a sarcophagus is also inside, that being porphyry, which is purple. And remember, the color of royalty for the imperial family was also purple. The palace church of Theodoric, which was later rededicated to St. Martin by the Byzantines, and then finally to St. Apollonarius, can be seen here in Ravenna. On the interior, we have a Western church design, which was a simple basilica type without a transept, without the T-bar of the cross T, for instance. Now this is known as St. Apollonarium Nuovo, or the new St. Apollonarius. So we have New Testament scenes with apostles and then a martyr procession that leads to an enthroned virgin and child, along with an enthroned Christ. The saints are going to be aligned rhythmically along the sides, one side male, one side female. The Byzantine remodelings are going to convert the Arian program to that of an Orthodox tradition. St. Martin, for instance, would replace a figure of a warrior who was not a saint fighting the Arians in Northern Europe. Seen here, he's a different color, and you can tell that it has been remodeled. Like the Arian baptistry, the figures are abstract and weightless. They are not individualized, nor frontally posed like the Byzantine examples. All of the virgins' faces, for instance, are all identical. They are not separated, and they alternate between a red crown and a green crown. The New Testament narratives in the top register are going to show the ministry of Christ paralleled by his passion. Little movement or drama is going to be in any of them, and the symmetrical groupings of figures with bold outlines against the gold Ravenette style are going to be quite common. Thus, of course, we minimize narrative action, and thus, of course, make them look iconic and permanent. This is actually taken from Matthew 4:18, where Christ, for instance, calls fishermen Simon, Peter, and Andrew to serve as his apostles, to follow him. The Ravenite style is already established before the Justinianic mosaics are going to be produced in Ravenna. The indigenous style is going to further abstract that of the Byzantine tradition. Turning now to Justinian, who would reclaim this area in Europe. He would never himself travel to Ravenna, but would still commission work showing that he had. Now in 539, Belisarius is going to recapture Ravenna and turn it into a sacred fortress of Byzantium lasting for 2 centuries. We find that the emperor never steps foot on the continent, but rules instead by exarchs or local governors carrying out his will. Now we find that San Vitale here, one of the best surviving series of mosaics of the Byzantine era, is going to be begun under the last years of Theodoric's reign and incorporates much of the Ravenite abstraction we just discussed. It is related by plan and design to Hagia Sophia as a model for this smaller version of the church. The central plan with 2 concentric octagons with an 8-leaf design can be seen. A simplified version, for instance, of St. Sergios and Bacchus or Hagia Sophia. We still have a double shell plan with an ambulatory, galleries, and semicircular niches.
The plan is going to be a central one, although it does have a longitudinal pull. It is designed with 2 concentric octagons that overlap one another that might at first look dissimilar to basilicas in the West, but have the same vocabulary and terminology to identify them. For instance, we still have a narthex, just like at Old St. Peter's, that introduces us to the space that we walk through and is important for processions in the Byzantine Orthodox tradition. We still have a nave in the center and side aisles, as well as an apse, that semicircular protrusion where the high altar will be, and then we have sacristies on either side, which is where the bishop, priests, and acolytes robe up before ceremonies. San Vitale is going to be dedicated by Bishop Maximinus here, and is named for San Vitalis. In 547, we can see with this dedication the plain brick exterior facade that would imitate and look like other early Christian churches, like St. Paul outside the walls or St. Peter's in Italy. The interior of San Vitale gives us a much better indication and record of what Byzantine churches would have originally looked like before they were converted into mosques. For instance, we have colored marble from floor to the walls to the ceiling, as well as colored columns and marble that's going to be used to decorate them as well. Mosaics decorate the sides of the walls, the spandrels, lunettes, and apse. The rich decoration is much like surviving Roman basilicas from the 5th and 6th century, such as St. Apollinaire Nuovo in Ravenna as well. Here we find processions of these martyrs are going to flank either side of the wall, and originally a rich golden mosaic would have occupied and would have been located in the apse here. Apses, of course, always represent heaven. The difference in the liturgical needs of the Greek Orthodox faith and that of the Roman Catholic can be seen here, as looking from the largest area, the apse, out into the central nave at San Vitale. Note that we cannot see the sides of the structure. Our view is limited. And of course in the Roman Catholic tradition this is not the case. Our view is unobstructed, allowing us to see the priest who remains stationary at the top of this design, elevated on a platform where the high altar is. This, of course, is going to reflect what we would have seen in the Hagia Sophia, where the laity only catch glimpses of this procession in the nave, as they would be behind 2 sets of columns pushed off to the side. So we see that the priests, the acolytes, and of course the emperor and imperial family would be walking in circles in the nave. Here we have an example of these Greek processions. Note, of course, that all the congregation is pushed off to the side and looking to the central section of the nave to witness what is happening with the Greek Orthodox liturgy.
In the interior, in the lunettes, we have Old Testament scenes over the arcades. Here we find the Feast of Abraham, showing the 3 angelic visitors with Abraham and Sarah before they tell him that she will give birth to a son. Here we have the advanced stage of abstraction in the Ravenite style we just discussed, popularized by those under Theodoric. A century earlier, we would have retained this type of antique illusionism, but now it is slowly being replaced. For instance, the table unfolds if you look at where the angels are seated. The food upon it facing us instead of at an angle on the table. The feet are going to project in an arbitrary fashion, being entangled with this M.C. Escher-esque type of design, with trees once again shadowed in stripes instead of casting shadows themselves. The mosaics seen here in the main central section are going to show the holy ratification of Justinian's rule and Christ's redemption of humanity.
Looking up into the apse, we see that Christ is going to be seated in heaven surrounded by clouds, angels, and saints, while below he looks down upon Justinian and Empress Theodora. Here we find a standard apse mosaic, which is common in Italy in the 5th and 6th century, which has Christ in heaven identified as a golden background with colored clouds above him, 4 rivers of paradise streaming from his orb throne, whereas we have a lush green set of greenery surrounding him, as well as peacocks, symbols of everlasting life, for it was believed that their flesh was incorruptible. Surrounding Christ, we have 2 angels who also are going to introduce Saint Vitalis, for which this church is named, and Bishop Ecclesias off to the right. Christ here is going to continue that tradition we discussed of philosopher, in which he is shown youthful and beardless, the early Christian version of Christ. He holds a scroll with 7 seals, as described in the book of Revelations 5:1. He sits on an orb of the world, representing his second coming when he returns to judge. He is going to be identified with a cruciform halo, which is reserved only for Christ, while other apostles and saints and angels might be identified as holy figures and as spiritually significant by halos. Only Christ has one with a Greek Orthodox cross, or the equidistant arms or bars of this cross behind his head. His eyes, of course, are going to be proportionally very large, and his face small, as he is framed with his face with this brown hair. The bishop next to him offers a model of San Vitale to Christ in this donor portrait, or a portrait of the person who paid to have an image created or a building constructed. He has on his head, identifying him as someone who has renounced worldly fashion and esteem, a clerical tonsure or shaved head, common among monks in the Middle Ages, especially Benedictine ones. The angels, Christ, and these earthly individuals are not shown as naturalistic or as representational. We are not trying to communicate a trompe-l'oeil effect or an illusionistic understanding of a picture window here. Instead, we are communicating this anti-naturalistic late antique style that becomes that early Christian style, taken even further in an iconic fashion by the Byzantines here.
As with the earlier Old Testament example, we have a further denial of illusionism that was very common in the 6th century in Rome. Under the Byzantine tradition, though, we find it is much more iconic and is going to avoid the traditional techniques associated with 3-dimensional space, such as modeling and overlapping.
Below Christ, we have Emperor Justinian and Empress Theodora, whose mosaics flank the high altar, even though they never visited Ravenna, are here shown as taking part in Mass, as part of the Eucharist. Off to the left of the high altar, we have Justinian, Bishop Maximinus, and attendants. A very excellent example of Byzantine mosaic art, in which it is made up of thousands of colored pieces of stone and glass, a very durable medium. And then, of course, gold being added to the surface wherever possible. Behind these figures, in the golden paten that the emperor holds, and in their robes, in the Bible that is encrusted with jewels held by a priest here. We find that at the left, we have the secular members of the retinue of Justinian, whereby his soldiers, his private guard, are going to be identified carrying a shield with the kyriota, or the monogram of Christ's name, his first three letters of his name in Greek. We then find that the emperor, dressed in purple, wearing red shoes, is going to be picked out as the most significant person. He is holding the golden paten of the Eucharistic bread. Hence, he is part of the liturgical session of Mass here, part of the bishop then blessing this golden paten, which will then become the body of Christ. Bishop Maximinus, who's going to be here to establish this church, is identified by name above his bald head as he holds a bejeweled crucifix here, a cross that would be carried in the procession. Justinian and the others are identified by way of their hierarchy because they overlap one another. Justinian has a halo, he is wearing a crown of jewels, and is picked out wearing purple, the color of royalty and the most expensive dye for fabric. It is obvious that he is the most significant person because no one else overlaps him. He is hieratic, solemn, and still. The rigid frontality seen here, as the figures are going to be staring out at us, is going to be accompanied by a lack of a background. Note that there is no setting for these figures. Even the ground plane, which is green, does not have shadows cast upon it, and there is a lighter halo almost, a glowing effect around their feet, which is going to thwart our ability to judge where they are in space. Only the hieratic notion of overlapping indicates their positioning. Therefore, the Roman naturalistic penchant for anecdotal detail is here lacking, even though each one of these images is a procession.
Unlike classical scenes and processions, there is a rigid frontality with no background. There's an overlapping here that shows the hierarchy, not in a naturalistic anecdotal way like we saw at the Areopagus Augustae. Instead, now we see the influence of the Ravenite style, whereby the same number of figures will flank a central figure that faces outward in a heraldic type of scene. The frontal position of these iconic protector saints will portray or are portrayed as this type of saintly emperor. Just like the earlier examples we looked at, he is the most important person. He has a halo and has those flanking him from the secular and the religious sides of his world.
The reasoning for this comes from Theodulf of Orleans, who in 790 writes, "God is beheld not with the eyes of the flesh, but only with the eye of the mind. Hence we are not attempting to show them naturalistically, but instead we are showing the spiritual reality behind this world that is more significant, more weighty and true." However, the further down the social ladder we go, the more naturalistic things become and that we can represent people, such as Theodora and her attendants, the Empress here, who is going to be an equal shareholder in power and authority according to Justinian and the historians of the day. Yet she is still not the emperor. Therefore, with her entourage, we find she carries the wine for the Eucharist and is located within the baptismal font and the area just outside of the high altar. She is followed by her entourage of women, her maidservants. Therefore, we have a distinct motion and movement from the right of the composition out into the left.
Theodora is going to be holding this chalice and is the second half of the Eucharistic couple, seen once again in actual examples of what would have been held at the time here with the chalice of Emperor Romanos II. The chalice, importantly, is the imperial donation, and in this offertory explicit example, the three magi are going to be embroidered on her robe, on the hem here, showing, of course, that like the three magi, she's giving a gift to Christ. Antonia, the wife of Belisarius, is also behind her.
The setting is going to be the atrium, where we're going to be suggesting movement. Because we have a lower social rank, it is less rigid. Surely we see that she is going to be positioned in a frontal fashion, her face looking out at the viewer, but her body is positioned in profile as she turns to walk towards this baptismal font, followed by these individuals suggesting this motion. The notion that the emperor and empress would be the significant participants in the liturgy is still carried on here as in the Hagia Sophia. The significance of them carried out and identified by their golden halo, by their bejeweled crowns and headdresses, by their purple cloaks.
Turning to the last example we'll discuss today of a transfiguration, we have Saint Apollinar of Clos in Ravenna. Here we can foretell what happens next with the evolution in the Byzantine style with iconoclasm. Here with the Transfiguration we have Bishop Apollinarius, who was martyred under Vespasian. His relics are going to be seen below. The mosaics are going to be a few years after San Vitale was finished, but we see a new style creeping in. Here we find that the saint is in an orans pose, or the prayer pose we saw from early Christianity, imitating the priest below, who would be in the same pose and dressed in the same way. The landscape behind him, though, is now highly abstracted and flat. There is no illusionism, nothing overlaps, and we don't get a sense of aerial perspective or any type of intuitive perspective. The individual motifs are treated completely separately, and we have this type of symmetrical rhythm that is going to move throughout. They're not integrated together, so we find that trees do not overlap one another, animals are not in front of or behind said trees or rocks. And the hand of God above is also seen, much like from Jewish art, with a portrait of Christ in the cross. Moses and Elijah are going to flank either side, these Old Testament prophets. The Old Testament figures are going to be shown as humans, but the New Testament figures are restricted to symbols very importantly. Thus the Transfiguration, where Christ is going to turn all white with his garments and float in the air, is treated in an aniconic style, so it is symbolic rather than figural now. So this foretells iconoclasm, in which we have an opposition to icon worship and a ban on imagery happening in 726. Symbolism is going to overtake representation, and now we're going to see these abstract symbols like crosses instead of images of Christ. So next class we'll continue on with the removal of the ban on images in the Middle Byzantine period.